Sally McManus, welcome to the program. Look, the Prime Minister there singing your praises. How would you describe these relationships right now? No red team, blue team, no unions, no bosses. Is that how you see it?
I'll come to that, David. It's a really good question. But the first thing I think is that I'd like to acknowledge the frontline workers at the moment, in particular the healthcare workers. This week's going to see that big surge in ICU, and we're going to rely on all those hospital workers, right through from the cleaners all the way through. And Australia's biggest, and some would say toughest union, the Nurses Union, is going to be on the front line of that, as well as all the other essential workers that are working. I think that it was an extraordinary moment last week, and we congratulate the government for their announcement. It was a right announcement, the wage subsidy one, as well as a childcare announcement, and the private hospitals too. They made really good decisions. I wouldn't say there's no unions, and I can assure the working people of Australia the trade union movement is still here and in their corner. Having said that, the fact that we're now consulting with the government means that better decisions get made because you're listening to more voices.
Now, you've welcomed the JobKeeper package. Should Parliament pass it quickly on Wednesday?
Well, we've got concerns about it, and obviously we've been raising those publicly and obviously privately with the government. Some of them go to who's covered by it. So, first of all, casuals. There's about 1.1 million casuals that will miss out on this payment because they haven't had 12 months continuous service. Now, there's lots of casual workers that may have work that's on and off, but it's regular. So arts and entertainment, construction industry, all of those places. Or you might have just started work this year, come back into the workforce and you're working regular hours. Those people need to be covered too. And then of course, there's all the visa workers. And when we think about Australian workers or anyone working in Australia, we've got to make sure they're not left to starve as well. So those issues we're advocating. The other concern we've got is there's a push by the government to change the Fair Work Act. We do not believe this is necessary. We've demonstrated it's not necessary. There's been changes to awards last couple of weeks covering millions of workers. And we're worried that if you change the rights of workers, unfortunately, some employers might abuse that.
All right, well, come to that. Let's start with the concern around casuals. More than 1 million casuals miss out because, as you point out, you have to have been tied to the employer for 12 months or more. Do you have to draw the line somewhere, though? What about casuals who've only just been with an employer for a couple of weeks?
I think it's reasonable to draw the line somewhere, absolutely. I think the best way of thinking about it is if you could have reasonably expected to be working, if it were not for the coronavirus, then you should get the JobKeeper allowance. Unfortunately, in our country, we've become so dependent on casual work, and so many employers would have had their casual workers working. Think about all the universities. More than 50% of the workers there are casual workers, and they won't get that allowance unless it changes.
So where would you draw that line?
Based on that principle, and that principle is actually a legal one, about whether you could have reasonably expected to be working. So that is because either you had shifts booked or you've been promised that you'd be working. There's a reasonableness test to it. And I think that would mean you'd pick up on all those people that, had already banked on the fact they'd have a job this year.
The government didn't put any limit, though, around how many hours a week you have to work. So you are going to have presumably quite a few casuals who may, students and so on, who may only do a shift or two a week. Suddenly they're going to get the full $1,500 a fortnight, more than they currently earn. Do you have an issue with that?
Well, it's a unique system our government's brought in. It's similar to the New Zealand one, a flat rate. So there's swings and roundabouts. Yes, it's true that lower paid workers and people who aren't full-time workers some of them will get more than they would have got. But it also means that higher paid workers will be getting much, much less than they would have got under, for example, the UK or the Danish system, where it's around 80 or 70% of wages. So, you've got to take those swings and roundabouts. The trade union movement's just willing to make this the best system we possibly can.
You raised the concern that Labor has as well about how to do this. The government wants to change the Fair Work Act with legislation. You're suggesting going through the Fair Work Commission and what, changing every award and every enterprise agreement?
Well, we want to see it happen by cooperation, not by legislation, as we have been cooperating. And not every instrument needs to change, not every enterprise agreement. There's lots of industries at the moment that aren't affected or are actually doing well under this crisis because they've got a lot more business. You think about all the utilities that are still working. There's no need to change those agreements. And if you have it imposed on workers, well, then some employers, unfortunately, might take advantage of it. So we believe everything can be done without changing the current system. Remember, the Fair Work Act is workers' rights. Like, just don't tinker with those workers' rights. We can make this happen.
Yeah, but if you try to change perhaps not every award or enterprise agreement, you've still got more than 100 awards, thousands and thousands of enterprise agreements. It's going to take longer, isn't it? I mean, you just changed 3 awards and that took how long? A couple of weeks for 3 awards?
About a week for nearly 2.5 million workers that are covered by them. And you think about it, they're the ones that are really affected. So it's the hospitality, the restaurants and the Clarks Award. That's a lot of people quickly done through agreement, really no fuss. It just means that there's some checks and balances. Workers are having a say over what they are rather than it being unilaterally determined by the government or by employers.
But what's your fear about changing the Act? Because the government argues this can be done very quickly. This week on Wednesday, change the Act. It's done. It's only for the finite period. This crisis lasts. Then you go back to where we were. What's wrong with that?
For example, we know that what's been considered is that an employer may be able to direct people just to take all their leave. Now, that is going to be sensible in some circumstances where an employer is shut down. And already, I mean, workers will make that decision to take leave rather than being on the JobKeeper allowance because it's going to be more money. But a whole lot of other employers that aren't affected, well, should they just be able to direct everyone to take their leave? Like, that doesn't sound like it's a fair situation. So we understand the government wants this over and done with and wants to make sure they've got everything in place. But we're just saying to them, you can get everything you want through cooperation and by doing it, through the way that we've already demonstrated that we can without, having those mistakes that will inevitably happen. And quite frankly, some rorting from some employers if you just go the full sledgehammer.
Yeah, I just want to be clear on this because, I'm certainly hearing a lot, and plenty of people are, workers who've still got a job but are being required to use up some of their annual leave. Are you saying that's okay in some instances, but there shouldn't be blanket provision for all employers to do this?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. There's no need for it to happen in a whole lot of areas where workers have been stood down, which basically means you're stood down, you're still employed, you're not receiving any money. You're going to get the JobKeeper allowance. Now, a lot of workers will say, my annual leave's more than that, I'm happy to run it down. Well, just let that happen. We shouldn't then open it up for a whole lot of employers just to use this as an opportunity to run down their liabilities and leave workers with no annual leave at all at the end of this. And that'd be bad for the economy. We're going to need people to go on holidays to get the domestic tourism going afterwards as well.
Well, indeed. But right now, for people who are earning more than $1,500 a fortnight, this JobKeeper allowance won't cover all of their income. Should they be required, if they want the rest of that income, to use annual leave?
Well, we think that most workers will make that decision. They already are. They're already making that decision now because if it's more money. But people have got families and there might be more than one income earner and they'll be able to balance what the best answer for them will be. We shouldn't have a situation where this money is used really to subsidise the leave entitlements. Rather, it's a wage subsidy and, we need to be clear about what it's for.
At the end of the day, should this hold up the passage of this, as you say, extraordinary JobKeeper payment?
Well, we don't want unintended consequences. We don't want a situation where we change workers' rights and we leave it open for some employers to be opportunistic or self-interest. Unfortunately, we know that most employers are good, but there's some out there that don't do the right thing.
Now, I appreciate your concern, but I'm just asking, at the end of the day, should Labor fight to the end on this, or should they make the point and then let it pass?
Oh, look, Labor and the Greens and the crossbenchers, we're saying to them that they should oppose changes to the Fair Work Act because they're just not necessary. We also haven't seen the changes the government's proposed yet, so I imagine things will develop over the next couple of days. All
right. Look, a few other issues. Minimum wage. The government wants a delay in the consideration of the annual minimum wage case. What do you think? Is it still worth pushing ahead with a pay rise right now?
Well, remember, minimum wage increases happen in the second half of the year, so that's from the 1st of July onwards. And we've got to think, as the Prime Minister's talked about the snapback. If we want a snapback, we're going to have to make sure that people have got money in their pockets because for a long time, we're going to depend on our domestic economy. All our small businesses are going to need people to have money in their pockets to spend it. So we think it's far too early to be saying that there should be any freezes on the minimum wage. In the end, the minimum wage has got to be enough for people to live on, and at the moment it's not. And we should, look at the other side of this pandemic and making sure that people have got enough money in their pockets.
Okay, but right now a lot of small business are closing. A lot of them are weighing up whether to close. We have no idea how bad the economy is going to get. To be clear, are you saying small business should pay, or you want them to pay a 4% increase in the minimum wage?
We're saying we should look at what will happen coming up to the 1st of July. It's so hard to know, David. Like 2 weeks ago, you would have said one thing. Next week, you might say another thing. We see what's happening with the curve. Maybe we're going to be through this by the second half of the year. Maybe we're not.
But this decision has to come before July. I just want to be clear. Your position is that we should still go ahead with a hearing and a decision before July?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. People should still, the minimum wage in this country should still be a living wage. A whole lot of people are going to know exactly
what With a 4% increase?
Well, we're asking for a 4% increase to the absolute minimum. Remember, the absolute minimum is only $39,000 a year.
But can small business afford that right now? As I say, they're closing their doors. Many of them are weighing up whether they can survive or not. Is a 4% increase in their wages bill something they can do?
Well, I think that this is something that needs to be closely looked at when we get to June, because that's when the decisions are going to need to be made. If we based on now, when we're not even in May, we're going to make the wrong decisions.
All right, so you may shift your own position on the 4% by June.
Oh, look, we're going to be sensible about it,
Okay.
Of course. We want to save jobs.
Can I just come back to where you started? You talked about the frontline workers this week, the nurses and so on. What about teachers, childcare workers as well? Schools, childcare centres and so on technically are going to be open, obviously operating at limited capacity. Do you have concern for those workers?
Well, all workers that are out working and not isolated at home at the moment are at more risk than people isolated at home. That's just a matter of fact. And so what we've been doing is working really closely with both employers and governments to make sure we put in place all the health measures. So obviously social distancing, obviously all the hygiene practices. Some of our workers still need to work. Like, we've got to keep the electricity on, we've got to keep work. Look at the retail workers. They're the ones also on the front line of this that are dealing with people every day. We know in our country we've had shortages of PPE. Hopefully that's personal protective equipment. Hopefully that gets fixed soon. And hopefully, all those workers that are out there supporting all of us, we've got to make sure that they are kept safe as well.
Can I finally ask you, Sally McManus, what you think the workforce may look like on the other side of this? Those of us lucky enough to have jobs still are working in a very different pattern right now, more working from home and so on. What's the workplace going to look like on the other side?
Well, we've got different experiences of this. On one hand, it's like a collective experience for everyone around the world, but at the moment you've got your frontline workers that are facing the virus, fighting the virus. You've got those support workers, you've got those workers working from home, some of them with kids as well, and you've got then people who have lost their jobs. I think the biggest thing for us as a country is we've got some strong institutions like our public health system, but casual work, too many insecure jobs. It's just been so exposed about how much risk has been shifted onto the individual. Coming out the other side, that's something we'd really like to see change. We need more permanent jobs for more Australians.
ACTU Secretary Sally McManus, thank you.
Thank you.